Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is May 26, 2024, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's a pleasure to welcome in discussion members of the Toronto, Calgary, and Chicago Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. This is the 9th meeting of our series on Plato's longest dialogue, The Laws. Today we're examining Book 6, which describes the offices for the new colony that Crete is establishing, and the methods by which its officers will be selected with a view to maintaining justice and virtue. As I did several times previously, I'll again be joining the participants in discussion and handing the role of moderator to Michael Fitzpatrick, who has also prepared today's notes. So with gratitude to Michael for organizing this meeting, before I turn the mic over to him, I want to speak for a few minutes to help set the context for understanding the operation of Crete's new colony. First, though, a reminder, as always, that to contribute your thoughts to the discussion, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom. And for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. So that everyone has a chance to speak, Michael will call on you in the order that hands are raised, using first name only. Once we finish recording in 2 hours, we invite anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So I have here on the screen a chart that provides an overview of the most important offices of the new colony and the method by which the officers are to be nominated and elected. A few quotes have been selected from the text to illustrate the context of justice and virtue by which the colony is to operate, so that we might see in this new colony something perhaps quite different from what exists today, 2,400 years after Plato's writing. So first I'll read the quotes and then briefly explain the chart. So this is, first quote is a short one. It's from 762e. No one will ever make a commendable master without having been a servant first. One should be proud not so much of ruling well, but of serving well, and serving the laws above all. And then we have at 777d. The best way to train slaves is to refrain from arrogantly ill-treating them, and to harm them even less, assuming that's possible, than you would your equals. You see, when a man can hurt someone as often as he likes, he'll soon show whether or not his respect for justice is natural and unfeigned, and springs from a genuine hatred of injustice. And I'll go over to 779a. This is the part about the wall. A wall never contributes anything to a town's health, and in any case is apt to encourage a certain softness in the souls of the inhabitants. It invites them to take refuge behind it instead of tackling the enemy and ensuring their own safety by mounting guard night and day. It tempts them to suppose that a foolproof way of protecting themselves is to barricade themselves in behind their walls and gates and then drop off to sleep as if they were brought into this world for a life of luxury. It never occurs to them that comfort is really to be won by the sweat of the brow, whereas the only result of such disgusting luxury and idleness is a fresh round of troubles, in my view. And then lastly at 782e. Observation tells me that all human actions are motivated by a set of 3 needs and desires. Give a man a correct education, and these instincts will lead him to virtue, but educate him badly, and he'll end up at the other extreme. From the moment of their birth, men have a desire for food and drink. Every living creature has an instinctive love of satisfying this desire whenever it occurs, and the craving to do so can fill a man's whole being, so that he remains quite unmoved by the plea that he should do anything except satisfy his lust for the pleasures of the body, so as to make himself immune from all discomfort. Our third and greatest need, the longing we feel most keenly, is the last to come upon us. It is a flame of the imperious lust to procreate, which kindles the fires of passion in mankind. These 3 unhealthy instincts must be canalized away from what men call supreme pleasure and towards the supreme good. So I read those just to kind of illustrate the backdrop for this community and the way it's being founded with a view to justice and virtue. So I wanted here to show this chart that I created, and I'll just kind of explain it to the listeners. And this is to explain the elections and offices in the city. So it starts at the top of the chart is the citizens of Knossos, which is the capital of Crete. And so the way this works, and Michael will explain this first part, the selection of the guardians of laws in his first reading. But the way this works is, or at least the Athenian is proposing, that the citizens of Knossos will provide 100 or appoint 100 colonist representatives. And then they'll add to those 100 of their own. So then there'll be a total of 200 representatives, half from Crete's capital and half colonists. And these will be the first people who will supervise the colony's election. So these are the people who will kind of make sure that it's being set up properly at the outset. So Once that is in place, then the current and past cavalry and infantry who have defended Crete, they will openly nominate and reject. And so they're doing this with their names being public. They're openly nominating and rejecting over 30 days. And this process results in 300 nominees. And then there's a second round in which 100 favorites are named out of the 300. And then in the third round, 37 are selected from the 300. So there's this election that results in 37 out of the top 300, and the 37 become the guardians of the laws. And so these are the most important people in the colony. They are the ones who will oversee the implementation of laws and also keep a register of and limitations on property. So if you remember a few books back, we talked about the problem that money causes, and when people's wealth gets exorbitant, it becomes a real problem in maintaining the harmony of the community. And so the guardians of the laws, one of their jobs is to maintain a register of property and make sure that nobody's property exceeds a certain limit. So then the guardians of the laws will nominate, firstly, generals. So they'll nominate candidates for general, and the generals will be elected in 2 rounds, again by the current and past cavalry and infantry. And then the guardians of the laws will also nominate the cavalry commanders, and they will again be elected by the same method. And then the generals nominate 12 company commanders, and they are elected as well. So we have in this chart this process where the colony is first overseen by 100 people from Crete and 100 local representatives among the colonists. They ensure that this election process and the nomination process is as fair as possible. And it seems, that there are some safeguards built into this so that there is multiple chances, especially in these multiple rounds of voting, where people can select, people can bring out issues with others. People can say that they reject a certain candidate. The rejection, for example, for the Guardians involves taking the tablet with a nomination into the marketplace and showing, I reject this person. And so it seems to be a fair and open process. So I just wanted to highlight this as the structure of how this community is going to start. And I just thought it would be helpful to illustrate this at the outset to kind of give you a bit of grounding in how this is going to be set up. So as I said, Michael will do the first reading, and that will talk about particularly the selection of the guardians of the laws, the 37 who are going to be the most important in the colony. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Michael.
Thanks, James. And before I start my introduction, I just want to note that it looks like in the chat, some people are having trouble downloading the handout, so you might just take a look at that. Today, we'll be discussing Book 6 of Plato's Laws. That may be a surprise to some, given that our meeting title includes Book 7. We were going to do a combination of excerpts from Book 6 and 7, but it ended up being too much material to cover in one recording. If you read part of Book 7 in preparation for today, don't worry, it wasn't in vain. We'll address that material in our next recording. And I apologize for any confusion I caused over my overambition in what I could cover today. At this point in the laws, we are making a significant transition from the moral psychology and educational theory of the early chapters, as well as the initial scaffolding of Magnesia, into thinking about what the real flesh and blood of the society would look like. To that end, Book 6 addresses at least two practical problems. It seeks to articulate who should lead and how to select them, and more challengingly, how to achieve this at the very founding of a society. Recall that Magnesia is an imagined new settlement being inaugurated from scratch, so it's the perfect canvas upon which to try something new. Doing something new is a major theme of our discussion today. I highlight this because Western societies today can often seem somewhat decadent in their affinity for conducting the selection of leaders in a particular way. Too often we end up with leaders of whom the best we can say is that they are the lesser evil. Plato would find that kind of description deeply disappointing. The goal is to build a good society served by good leaders. The goal is not to find something that is less evil than something else. Plato invites us in this selection of the laws to take an imaginative leap, to explore new ways of placing people in power. He explores new forms of elections. He explores sortition, that is, the process of random selection of citizens for service, commonly used in a military draft or for jury duty. He explores scrutiny, a procedure for assessing candidates for office based upon their virtue and competence to perform the service required of them. Scholars today are thinking about these questions as well. Our title page features an excerpt from Rutgers political philosopher Alexander Guerrero, proposing that we move from an electoral democracy to a lawtocracy, that is, a society in which people are randomly selected to single-issue task force. It's an intriguing thesis that has its roots in Plato's political proposals here. The Laws is part of Plato's trilogy of political writings, imagining a society from scratch. We have the Republic, with its Callipolis, a society imagined purely in the ideal. We have Critias, with its history of Atlantis, a society imagined in our past. And we have the Laws, with its proposal for Magnesia, a society imagined in the near future. That means Plato has his characters wrestle with the question of how to actually found such a society in the near future. What kind of steps would we have to take? The questions are even harder for those of us in entrenched societies who have to work from within the existing structures. Plato also presents us with a non-liberal conception of equality, and that is going to be difficult for some of us to grasp today. One of our dominant political frameworks, liberalism, says that people are either inherently of equal worth or at least of equal worth in the eyes of the law. But as Aristotle pointed out in the very first book of his Politics, people are empirically not equal. Some are more talented, others have made greater contributions to society, and many of us have been disadvantaged by chauvinism, bad luck, and lack of education. So on what basis is this claim of equality made? Anticipating this problem, Plato claims that we have to think two thoughts at once. We are equal in a very important respect and unequal in another just as important respect. We are equal in the sense that the common good belongs to us all. There is no one who deserves, by merit or birth or any other grounds, to have less of a share in the common good. However, we are not equal when it comes to our progress towards virtue. This is critical to acknowledge because Plato contends that much suffering in society is a consequence of giving power to people lacking in virtue. He argues that we should not believe that all people are equal in their ability to serve in public office. Only those who are virtuous and competent should do so. That said, he does nonetheless believe that the virtuous leader can come from anywhere, any town, any race, any class, any sex. So while he does not support equal appointment to public office, Plato does reject inequalities of appointment to public office on the basis of discrimination according to irrelevant characteristics. Together, his rejection of that inequality and his insistence that all are equal in their share of the common good makes the inequality he does embrace with respect to virtue less off-putting than we might have thought at first blush. So I'm going to start here on page 2 of the handout. People should be able to download this. This is our first theme, which I titled "I'm Not Doing Things the Same," because this is where Plato really wrestles with this question of how to take an imaginative leap in thinking about building a society with leaders who are different from the mold of leaders that people in his day were most familiar with. So I'm going to read 751A to 754D. Well then, now that I've got all that off my chest, your next job will be to appoint officials for the state, the Athenian says. Clinias, it certainly will. There are two stages involved in organizing a society. First, you establish official positions and appoint people to hold them. You decide how many posts there should be and how they ought to be filled. Then each office has to be given its particular laws. You have to decide which laws will be appropriate in each case and the number and type required. But before we make our choice, let us pause a moment and explain a point that will affect it. And what's that? Asked Clinias. It's this. It's obvious to anyone that legislation is a tremendous task, and that when you have a well-constructed state with a well-framed legal code, to put incompetent officials in charge of administering the code is a waste of good laws, and the whole business degenerates into farce. And not only that, the state will find that its laws are doing it damage and injury on a gigantic scale. Naturally, Clinias says. Now let's notice the relevance of this to your present society and state. You appreciate that if your candidates are to deserve promotion to positions of power, their characters and family background must have been adequately tested right from their childhood until the moment of their election. Furthermore, the intending electors ought to have been well brought up in law-abiding habits, so as to be able to approve or disapprove of the candidates for the right reasons and elect or reject them according to their deserts. But in the present case, we are dealing with people who have only just come together and don't know each other, and they're uneducated too. So how could they ever elect their officials without going wrong? It's pretty well impossible, Clinias says. But look here, once in the race, you've got no excuses, as the saying is. That's just our predicament now. You and your 9 colleagues, you tell us, have given an undertaking to the people of Crete to turn your energies to founding the state. I, for my part, have promised to join in with this piece of fiction I'm now relating. Seeing that I've got on in telling a story, I'd be most reluctant to leave it without a head. It would look a grim sight wandering about like that. And it's a fine story it's been, sir, Clinias says. Athenian, surely, but I also intend to give you actual help along those lines as far as I can. Clinias, then let's carry out our program, certainly. Athenian, yes, we shall, God willing, if we can keep old age at bay for long enough. Clinias, God willing, can probably be taken for granted. Athenian, of course. So let's be guided by him and notice something else. What? That we'll find we've been pretty bold and foolhardy in launching this state of ours. Clinias, what made you say that? What have you in mind? The Athenian responds, I'm thinking of the cheerful way we're legislating for people who will be new to the laws we've passed, without bothering how they'll ever be brought to accept them. It's obvious to us all, Clinias, that even if we're not very clever, that at the start they won't readily accept any at all. Ideally, we'd remain on the spot long enough to see people getting a taste of the laws while they're still children. Then, when they've grown up and have become thoroughly accustomed to them, they can take part in the elections to all the offices of the state. If we can manage that, assuming acceptable ways and means are available, then I reckon that the state would have a firm guarantee of survival when its school days are over. That's reasonable enough, Clinias says. So let's see if we can find ways and means. Will this do? I maintain, Clinias, that of all the Cretans, the citizens of Gnosis have a special duty. They must not be content with simply doing all that religion demands for the mere soil of your sentiment. They must also take scrupulous care to see that the first officials are appointed by the best and safest methods. And it's absolutely vital to give your best attention to choosing, first of all, guardians of the laws. Less trouble is needed to be taken over the other officials. Clinias, so can we find a reasonable way of going about it? Athenian, yes. Sons of Crete, I say, as the Nosans take precedence over your many cities, they should collaborate with the newly arrived settlers in choosing a total of 37 men from the two sides, 19 from the settlers, the rest from Gnosis itself. The gift of the Nosians to this state of yours, Clinias. They should include you in the 18 and make you yourself a citizen of the colony with your consent, failing which you'll be gently compelled. Clinias, but why on earth, sir, haven't you and Megillus too enrolled as joint administrators? Athenian, Clinias, Athens is a high and mighty state, and so is Sparta. Besides, they're both a long way off. But it's just the right thing for you and the other founders. And what I said a moment ago of you applies equally to them. So let's take it. We've explained how to deal with the present situation. But as time goes on and the Constitution has become established, the election of these officials should be held more or less as follows. Everyone who serves in the cavalry or infantry and has fought in the field while young and strong enough to do so should participate. They must proceed to election in the temple which the state considers to be the most venerable. Each elector should place on the altar of the god a small tablet on which he has written the name of the person he wishes to vote for, adding the candidate's father, tribe, and deme. And he should append his own name with the same details. For at least 30 days, anyone who wishes should be allowed to remove any tablet bearing a name he finds objectionable and put it on display in the marketplace. Then the officials must exhibit to the state at large the 300 tablets that head the list. On the basis of this list, the voters must then again record their nominations, and the 100 names that lead this second time must be publicly displayed as before. On the third occasion, anyone who wishes should walk between the victims of a sacrifice and record which of these 300 he chooses. The 37 who receives most votes must then submit to scrutiny and be declared elected. Well then, Clinias and Megillus, who will make all these arrangements about these officials in our state and their scrutiny? We can surely appreciate that as the state apparatus is as yet only rudimentary, such people will have to be on hand, and they could hardly be available before any officials at all have been appointed. Even so, we must have them, and these 200 persons mustn't be feeble specimens either, but men of the highest caliber. As the proverb says, getting started is half the battle, and a good beginning we all applaud. But in my view, a good start is more than half, and no one has yet given it the praise it deserves. That's quite true, Clinias says. The Athenian continues, so as we acknowledge the value of a good beginning, let's not skip discussion of it in this case. Let's get it quite clear in our own minds how we can tackle it. I have no particular points to make except one, which is vitally relevant to the situation. And what's that? Apart from the city which is founding it, this state we are about to settle has, so to speak, no father or mother. I'm quite aware, of course, that many a foundation has quarreled repeatedly with its founder state and will again. But in the present circumstances, we have, as it were, the merest infant on our hands. I mean, any child is going to fall out with his parents sooner or later. But while he's young and can't help himself, he loves him and they love him. He's forever scampering back to his family and finding his only allies are his relatives. That's exactly the way I maintain our young state regards the citizens of Gnosis and how they regard it, in virtue of their role as its guardians. I therefore repeat what I said just now. There's no harm in saying a good thing twice. That the citizens of Gnosis should choose colleagues from among the newly arrived colonists and take charge of all these arrangements. They should choose at least 100 of them, the oldest and most virtuous they can find, and they themselves should contribute another 100. They should enter the new state and collaborate in seeing that the officials are designated according to law, and after designation, scrutinized. When they've done all that, the citizens of Gnosis should resume living in Gnosis and leave the infant state to work out its own salvation and flourish unaided. I'd now like to open up our discussion to hear people's reactions to our first passage here. There's a lot in it, And I kind of want to ask an initial question here at the place where the reading ended, in part because there's a sense in which the Athenian is working backwards through this part of the dialogue, because the discussion here at the end is actually where they're going to start. He's reverse engineering the problem here. He's sort of thinking, okay, here's where we need to get to. What steps need to proceed in order to get there? And then what steps need to precede that step? So he discusses earlier the election of the guardians of the laws for the Magnesia, but then he has to ask the question, who are going to be the electors for those initial set of guardians? And here he gives us this proposal, which I think is really interesting, and I'd like to hear people's reactions to, about drawing virtuous people from another town or region to come and partner with the settlers of a new area in order to allow them to benefit from the virtue that already exists in that already existing area. So Plato is sort of recognizing, although the city of Magnesia is starting from scratch, the world is not starting from scratch. There are already virtuous people in the world, and why don't we have some of them take a term of service and go to new colonies like Magnesia and help them get, as he calls it, a good beginning. So with that, I'd be curious to know what people think of this idea, generalizing a little bit, of helping countries. It doesn't even have to be blank slate settlements, just countries sort of get their footing by bringing in virtue from other lands to aid them. And as always, please raise hands and I will call on people in order. James, go ahead and start us off.
This was really interesting in terms of the kind of parent and child analogy. And what's really interesting too is that it's not being proposed as a popularity contest, but something that is purely based on virtue. So that the first people who are chosen to select these guardians have to be virtuous. And so it's really kind of getting the child, the new infant state off on the right foot, which is the job of a parent, is to get the child off on the right foot. The other interesting thing about this is that they go in to found the new colony with a view to exiting it, which is not something that has been practiced, I think, in a lot of modern empire building. And, I'm thinking, for example, about Canada when, the English and the French first sailed in the what was it, the late 1400s, early 1500s, and took over. There was no plan for them to exit. The exit came much later in 1867. But I like this idea that there's a plan at the outset to kind of, once birth has been given and the child has been nurtured, that they have given them their best that they can, and that it's the child's business at that point to make it. So I really thought that was an interesting thing. That's something that we don't practice, I think, in the modern sense of the way colonies and empires are established. Thank you.
There's a concept that will be familiar to those of us who've read through other works of Plato, that he has Socrates sometimes describe himself as a midwife. And the idea is that he's there to help people birth their own ideas, think for themselves. And although that metaphor, to my recollection, doesn't come up in the laws, I very much think that, James, your comments sort of help us to see that it's the same basic framework that Plato is working with here, that the Gnostians are expected to be a kind of midwife for Magnesia until it gets off the ground and can flourish unaided. That's very similar to, a child can feed and clothe itself and so forth. And I think you're right that the really crucial idea here is the Gnostians are there in part because their fates will not be tied up in Magnesia, meaning they can bring a level of impartiality or objectivity to the settlement that will not be as easy for the settlers themselves, because they're going to have a very strong vested interest in the outcome of the states. What positions of power can I get for myself Whereas the Nocians, they're going to go back to their home country. So they don't need to have a vested interest in who gets what positions. And that allows them to focus more on promoting virtue within that colony. Yeah, Phil, what are your thoughts?
I have a question, and then I have a sort of somewhat of a disagreement. The question I have is that is Magnesia really another city, or is it part of the country of Crete, of the colony of Crete? Because one is then a separate thing. The other thing is like is within it, you might say, more naive or less developed, but nonetheless is part of the whole. So that I had a question about, like, what is it, the relationship between
Yeah, let me
supposedly
let,
the
let me
father and the
speak
child?
let me speak to that real quick, and then I'll let you make your comment because I know you had further thoughts. The whole Thessalian peninsula and the island of Crete, that whole area was a network of city states,
Hmm.
which the best analogy for us today would be something like maybe provinces, something like that, where, well, even that's not quite right because there's no unifying government. So it's not like Magnesia is going to be part of some larger national government. But the city states were autonomous, but they were often allied with each other, or they would have, special trade relations. So I don't know if that helps your question, but Magnesia is not going to be like an outpost of the Nocians or something like that. It's not something that they're going to own or have any control over. And Crete is at this time not a country. It's just an island with these little city states populating it.
Okay, so nonetheless, these quote newcomers from other city states will develop eventually an alliance, I imagine, right? It's because otherwise, why would they even come and be part of this loosely knit community? The second thing I have is that, okay, that sort of partially answered my second question, but it I am not assuming that in the sense that the notions are more virtuous to begin with. I'm assuming that that's distributed and that in some sense, even if it's the way I see it, at least maybe they're a little bit more educated and all that. I'm assuming that in some sense, it's really creating a kind of harmony in the sense that they could come and produce new ideas and freshen the blood of the tradition. Because the way I saw it was really a matter of balance, the tradition, not necessarily the virtue, versus the new insights, new possibility. And that mix, in a sense, allow it to develop a kind of harmony that has the both what is tradition, what tradition regard as containing virtue, and maybe new inputs. And that to me is a much more sort of even handed by not saying, well, you guys are just sort of like not very good at this. Let me educate you. Yes, that is part of the truth because otherwise, why would they come to Gnosis? But on the other hand, I think the fresh blood allows it to move ahead and churn new ideas. So that's good in the sense by explaining that they're really not yet one unified system. That's it. Thank you.
I love that notion. I hadn't quite thought of framing it this way, but I really like your notion of the intermingling as a way of disrupting the previous way of doing things. And they're going to expose each other to new ideas. The Nocians will go back to their town and they'll have learned something from the creation of Magnesia. And likewise, the Magnesians will have learned something from the notions as they're getting this state off the ground. And so you're sort of saying, like, yeah, it's good to bring in perspectives from other places because that's how we discover new things and we get outside of the mold of how we've been doing things. And I think that really nicely connects, Phil, with the fact that, right above this section, the Athenian, responds kind of curtly to Clinias saying, why don't you and Megillus come and join in the founding as well? And he says, oh, well, they're so far away. But I think there's a sense here in why Plato has an Athenian lead the discussion, but it's not an Athenian founding the state. It's going to be Clinias who does that, is probably because he wanted this to be a dialogue that enlivened or refreshed the traditions of Athens. He wanted this to be a little more alien so that Athenians reading it would be like, oh, wow, that's really different than how we do things. So I think that's maybe another way of kind of bringing out that wonderful idea of yours.
Do object to the dialogue somewhat because the other characters are just simply like, yes, I agree with you. That must be the way it is. And it's really more like a continuous soliloquy with just sort of like, could you say some more about that rather than having a real true input? I wish there was just a little bit. Yeah, I don't think that's right. Could you straighten that out? I mean, I wish there was a little more questioning the sort of soliloquy that's being given as if this guy is just so wise, we can't possibly disagree with him. So that was a little imbalance just in the way the dialogue is constructed. That's it. It's not really a disagreement, but it seems too one-sided.
Well, that's a common concern people have had with some of the dialogues where they say, oh, there's too much of a yes man in the conversation. I do think there are sections of the laws, chapters where there is a bit more of a back and forth, maybe not as much in this section, but in others. Where there aren't back and forth discussions, I think it's because Plato is trying to model what it looks like to unfold a sustained thought. And so there are dialogues where there's really strong disagreement, really strong back and forth, like the Gorgias. And then there's dialogues like this one where in like the early books, there was a lot of disagreement between the interlocutors. But at this point, we are getting to a place where, yeah, there's clearly an agenda. There's a thought that is getting unfolded. And as you said, the interlocutors tend to take more of a back seat and just let the Athenians sort of get it all out on the table. And that's okay. We get to make the objections ourselves. And I think Plato wants us to do that. So thank you for doing that. Darren.
I guess just my quick remark about what you guys were just talking about, and then I have a couple of my own comments. So I think the laws is kind of weird, at least starting in the last book, where it became much less of a dialogue than a monologue. I mean, in the last book, it was all the Athenian. There was not a single thing said by the other two characters. So the book seems to have like really taken a turn there. I mean, there could just be like historical reasons for this in the sense of this is Plato's last dialogue. And I really liked the first three books. I thought they were as strong as, possibly some of Plato's best works. Maybe in the top third. But I think it's starting to suffer in the in books. I think last time especially. I mean, it was literally just one person talking the whole time. And even this book, I found it kind of scattershot. It's sort of all over the place. It's like I don't know. It's not very well organized. It's not terrible, but I feel like it's not up to par with Plato's best efforts. And also there's another thing about like the back and forth we see in other dialogues. Like Plato or Socrates often like as Michael was saying, like people criticize the dialogues for having too much of a yes man dialoguing with Socrates, but I found that in many dialogues it really has to be understood within the context of the personalities involved and what they're talking about. And also Socrates even like seems to exert a kind of aura or authority on other people, or other people sense that like they're afraid of him because of his reputation. And Socrates engages with that in different ways. So anyway, I just think there's a lot of different reasons for the different style of conversation you see in a lot of different dialogues, and the drama matters a lot to how to understand that. Okay, so onto this particular the reading we just did. Yeah, so regarding how the Nocians are able to help or are going to be part of the establishment of this colony. I actually find it for, I guess, maybe practical purposes or for our thinking about our own societies, actually a little bit unfair because they're starting from scratch in a way, and they are already assuming they have this group of virtuous people from the outside to help them establish a brand new colony. When are we ever going to be confronted with this like very ideal situation like this, almost like a blank slate kind of thing? So I'm not saying this is not interesting as a thought experiment, but like I think we have to think carefully how this whole scenario that's going to be described will be should inform our own thinking about our own societies, just because the context is so different. And I'm sure we're going to get to the parts later on where they talk about what we mean by equality. And there's a very interesting remark there where they say the person to be able to judge the virtue of others would require the wisdom and judgment of Zeus. So that's something to think about. Like, let's say we had an opportunity to attempt this today. How would we even identify the 100 most virtuous people? Like, that's prior to a democratic process because the voting doesn't take place until after this part, after it's established. So where is this like, virgin birth coming from? So anyway, I'm just saying that I'm just going to pose that as a problem. And then the second thing regarding the reading so far is this is just a little thing. I don't know how it might affect our thinking about this, but the problem that seems to be confronting them is not just like how to choose, as like the book 6 began with having to discover having competent officials to implement and execute the laws. And you don't want to choose anyone random. Like the additional little bit of a problem that they have is that they're trying to create brand new laws, like this radically different laws from anywhere else. It's from anywhere else, anywhere else we've seen. Although they do take elements from bits and pieces from different places, but the package and other things on top of all those bits and pieces they gather from other places, like the whole package is just like radically new and different. So, which is why the beginning of book 6, as the section Michael read, they asked the question. Athenian asked the question, how they'll ever be brought to accept these laws. And indeed, he says then at the start, they won't readily accept any at all. So, so you can't choose it amongst the people because like literally they had no say in these laws and they're radically new. They're things people aren't used to. We're going to see a lot of radical things coming up. So I think that's an additional part of the problem. It's not even just we need competent people. It's like we need competent people to implement these laws that no one has ever heard of before and people won't accept. Like the problem might be a little bit different if they're just establishing a new colony, but it's going to be more or less the same as the previous places that people are from, right? But that's not that's not the thing that's happening. So anyway, I just thought I'll just maybe throw that in there as additional bit of context that might affect how we think about this book.
Those are wonderful comments, Darren. In some ways, you anticipated essentially what were going to be my next discussion question. So I love that they're arising organically, and I don't think that's by accident. I actually think Plato wants those questions to arise from this reading because you're right. I love the metaphor you use here. You call this a virgin birth problem. This idea of how do you get something from nothing, in a sense. How do you start in a world where there isn't already an education system promoting virtue, there isn't already laws promoting virtue? How do you get those laws and that education system in place? In a world where there isn't already virtuous leaders or virtuous electors, how do you get virtuous leaders and electors in place? And yes, I do think, Plato is slightly cheating by using a blank slate model here, but the blank slate is really there to sort of give us the picture of the optimal conditions so that we can ask ourselves exactly what you did. How would we do this? And I think there are some interesting analogs that we could draw with the modern world. We might think of the problem facing the United States in the wake of World War II with the reconstruction of Japan. Um, General MacArthur had a similar type of question here of, what do we do? Do we just, back away and sort of let Japan rebuild on its own? What direction will it go? Or do we occupy Japan and try to give them the best of the Western tradition, and then 7 years later, leave just like the Nosens do here and let Japan continue on its own. There's a lot of questions we could ask about a concrete bit of history like that, but I think there are a lot of cases like that. You think of attempts by the United Nations to go into civil war torn countries and try to help the country rebuild. These might be ways that we could create modern analogs for our world today and see if we could use Plato's model to bridge the gap. But there still is this question of, for those of us living in societies that are well established with long existing institutions, how can we reform them towards justice if they're not already oriented towards justice? And I don't think Plato has any illusions here that he has presented us with some ready-made solution to that problem. But what he's trying to do is foster the very types of questions that you've been asking, and I hope we continue to ask them today. Kieran.
Hi, I just have a quick clarificatory question about this paragraph 753b to 754a. Plato describes a process which seems, at least to me, maybe I'm misreading this, somewhere between a rank choice vote and a negative election, maybe. I'm struggling to figure out exactly how to characterize it. And I was particularly just a little confused by the line, any man who chooses shall be permitted to remove any tablet which seems to him to be improperly written and to place it in the marketplace for not less than 30 days. Is there a significance to this, like the specific number 30 days? I feel like Plato often, they're these very, very specific details. I'm never quite sure what's motivating them, but yeah.
There almost always is significance to the numbers. I'll let James weigh in later if he wants to for some of the mathematical motivations that Plato has behind some of these number choices. Often he chooses numbers that have a certain mathematical elegance to them, that he thinks the math is actually showing us something that is a natural form for organizing the material world. But there are also other more practical considerations that he often has. And I think here, the 30 days, so the idea here is that, as some of you probably noticed in my footnote, I said, this is kind of akin to the old European practice of when you want to get married, you post your marriage announcement in the public square, and then you have to allow, I think, 3 weeks to go by for word to get out in case anybody has an objection to the marriage. And it's sort of a process like that, where 30 days ensures that in this time period where the mode of communication across the area is limited, that there's enough time for enough people, not just from the immediate city square, but the outlying areas, to wander through the marketplace, which would have been the most well-trod of the whole town, to go through, to look at this, and for one of them to say, hey, yeah, I know that person, they're not bad, or they are bad, or whatever. I can add my voice to the concerns about this particular person. So I think the practical consideration is we want enough time for a true vetting to happen, that we're not going to rush to a decision. We're really going to let the nominated candidates percolate before any kind of decision is made. And I think the other thing that's really important about this framework here is the size of the numbers. So we're working with 300 involuntary candidates. So these are not people putting their own name forward. And 300 is a size where it's very hard to, rig the vote in certain ways, because we're not dealing with one candidate out of 3 nominees. One victor out of 3 candidates. We're dealing with 300 candidates. That's going to result in 37 people selected. And I think Plato is aware that if you get the numbers to a certain size, it makes it so that a lot of voting strategies that bedevil modern electoral systems are just no longer practical. Kieran, did you want to say anything more about that, or is that good for now?
No, thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Okay, Phil, jump back in here.
My question really arises from what Darren said and your response. Is I'm thinking this move by Plato or Socrates or the Athenian, I would say, is really, in a sense, changing the whole structure of relationships between cultures, between city-states, I'll put it this way. Because prior to this, it seemed to me city-states, when there's a disagreement, it's settled in hard power. In other words, it's going to be war. Damn it, you don't agree with us, we're going to destroy you or be destroyed. What this does is to create a structure of soft power. I call soft power, which is let's not get into destruction. Let's just talk about this and have emergence of diplomacy. This is exactly what happened with Germany and Japan. We could have done what France did after World War I, which is to punish, because they deserve punishment, the Germans. And what that led to was another conflict, even a greater conflict, World War II. And what the Americans realized was that, no, we really need to teach them to talk about things rather than going to war. And as a matter of fact, it becomes a kind of soft power. Now, there's not necessarily a good manifestation of this. I'll say something slightly negative, but in a way it's also positive. This is really, in a sense, a contrast between colonialism and what I would call neocolonialism, right? And the thing about that neocolonialism is you go in there and you inject ideas. And the greatest manifestation of that is Hong Kong. When the British colonized Hong Kong, of course, then invaded by Japan and therefore the Civil War in China and all that, it was settled that there was going to be a period of time when there's going to be transition back to China because it was a treaty. And the British at that time had treated Hong Kong prior to the period as a true colony, in other words, in terms of hard power. But when they realized that, 1997 was coming up, I think beginning probably in the 60s, they began to give the Chinese people within the population much more say in what controls China and begin to integrate them into the ideologies and ideas of liberalism in Hong Kong, because they know once it's handed over back to China, of course, there's going to be a period of transition at that point, that Hong Kong will maintain at least that conceptual idea and, in a sense, resist the communist ideas to a certain degree. And to a certain degree, that worked until, of course, China came down hard in Hong Kong, as we know with the umbrella revolutions. So in some sense, it doesn't quite work depending how hard a hard power is. But nonetheless, soft power and the notion of negotiations allows it for a much gentler conflict, let's put it that way. So I think that's a good strategy between hard power and soft power. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, Phil, I love those comments so much. I think that's spot on. Plato makes clear throughout this dialogue and others that he wants to move from a model that incites war to a model that moves through persuasion. That doesn't mean there aren't places where coercion is needed, but he would prefer, as far as possible, that the only coercion that is happening is exactly the kind that we saw a reference to Clinias, which is good people are compelled to serve. Other than that, he would prefer what you call soft power. And I love how it just dovetails with the history of that time, because the Thessalian city-states, even though they all shared language and common traditions, they did not get along. And they were constantly forcing each other to become tribute states for the other. And really, what I think influenced Plato's thinking was the threat of larger empires beyond Thessaly overrunning the entire peninsula. And he realized, there's always going to be a bigger bully. And what if instead of always fighting with each other, we learned how to negotiate in peace so that we could unify to stand up to the larger imperial powers beyond Thessaly? And I think that really transformed his thinking to say, we should be as little like something like the Persian Empire as possible. We should be not that. And what does not that look like? And that starts to move him in the direction of the soft power that I think you've so eloquently described. So thank you. We're going to move to Darren and Ella, but I want to note that after Ella's comment, I'd like to move on to the second reading for the sake of time. So I just want to flag that for people. So Darren, go ahead.
Okay. Just, I guess, some quick comments on the voting procedure here. So I was quite interested in this. I've never known this was in Plato before. I like some aspects of it about how it's different than what we do or what many places do, or any place does actually. So I kind of like how drawn out the process is. So as you know, we've read and others have commented, there's like multiple rounds of voting where the winners are like gradually whittled down. And then after each vote, there seems to be, this waiting period before the results actually finalize. So that's interesting. I wish there was more said about the thinking behind this, but I think the kind of stretched out time period is interesting and maybe allows more time for reflection on who might be the best candidate. However, I'm not convinced, although like it seems like you vote for whoever you want, people don't put themselves forward necessarily, but I'm not convinced that there still wouldn't be campaigning involved in the background in the lead up to this, where people are, are still, although they're not like, people aren't nominated in the first round per se, in the very first round, like you just vote for, whoever. That's what it sounds like. I'm not convinced that there wouldn't be like shenanigans leading up to that. So I'm just gonna put that out there. And then just quickly, the other thing that I thought was interesting that we don't do here in Canada, or the US doesn't do, and a lot of places don't do, is the mandatory voting thing. I think that's interesting. Like, and if people who don't vote, they have to be punished and pay fines or whatever. So I think that part's interesting. Again, I wish there was more said about the rationale behind it, but yeah, it's also good to think about how like democracy isn't just democracy. I think it's futile to criticize democracy as democracy sometimes, just in the very abstract. Like we see here that it's instantiated in like very specific systems of voting that can have like radically different effects on what happens. So one of the things I've seen so far, at least, I mean, we're into book 6, I've seen throughout the laws is how important institutions matter. So I think institutions of voting matter quite a bit and might be more productive than talking about democracy in general. So that's it.
Yeah, nice. And not only voting, because as you know from other readings, that, Plato is quite aware that elections have their own problems. And so one of the things that's really fun about the laws, and I flag this just for people to pay attention to as you go through further readings as we get deeper into the text, there's going to be other selection processes put forward for other offices that are different from this. Remember, this is the process for the initial selection of the nation's guardians, both the guardians of the laws and the initial set of military commanders. So we're sort of getting the system in place, but then as we create other offices and other structures throughout the society, Plato's actually going to play around with a lot of different methods of doing a selection. And that's what I think is really fun and productive about the laws. Necessarily agree with any particular proposal. We might look at this and see strengths and weaknesses. What I really appreciated is the fecundity of what we're reading, how it pushes us to say, oh, wow, there's really a lot of different ways of doing this. And there's not just this one model that everybody has to do, or it's not a free society. And the only other thing I want to add to your comment, Darren, is I do want to emphasize this notion of scrutiny. This will come up more and more as we go through the laws. And it's a notion that just because you get the most votes for an office does not mean you automatically get elected. You have to go through a further check and balance that assesses you according to some public criterion as to whether or not you are virtuous and competent sufficient to the office you're about to undertake. So you are sort of a guardian elect when the votes are tallied, but until you pass scrutiny, you're not actually going to be an office holder. And I think that is something that really differs from the way we tend to do elections today, where we think, yeah, if you win an election, even if you're a terrible person, you get to hold the position of power. And Plato does not buy into that at all. He thinks, no, the real goal is to put good people in power. And so we need to have a process of scrutiny that complements the process of election. Okay, let's go to Ella, and then Ian, I see your hand, so I'll give you the first comment after I read the next reading. I just want to make you aware that that's how this will go. Ella, give us our last comment on this section.
Yes, I was thinking, this is my first time reading through this, and my thoughts are that it's quite an opportunity to sit down and discuss building a government from scratch in Magnesia. Because if you're trying to restructure a given government situation, let's say with economic equality, it's like you have children and one child has 2 ice cream cones and you accidentally give them 2 and you forgot to give one to the other child. You go to take one of the ice cream cones from the first child and give it to the second who has none, you're going to have a situation on your hands. So when you have a government that is already established and about 10% or less has 2 ice cream cones and a lot of other people don't, you have a lot of frustration in trying to establish economic equality. Now, if you're going into the island here, however, as a bit of an outsider with some understanding and wisdom, and someone had spoken about this earlier, that they even spoke about zoos, where you're going to get the ethics and the morals. Okay. Well, the thing that came to mind with this opportunity of building this government from scratch, coming in as an outsider who wants to assist in that democratic effort, then one might use John Rawls' more contemporary veil of ignorance. Because, when you think about trying to apply it to society that already exists, you're going to have the ice cream cone dilemma, redistributing what has already been distributed for hundreds of years. But in this particular situation, you have the opportunity to put on the veil of ignorance, to think about it. You could end up in any one of those homes. You could end up being someone who may be marginalized for whatever, any number of reasons. And John Rawls, sort of suspends you and you're hovering over the earth and you don't know which home, which family you will be going into on the island, let's say, in this case. And maybe these outsiders could actually live there for a while and have to construct something that is going to be where they, their families, would live and be treated well. And it's just a way of looking at it. And I know Plato takes a lot of that into consideration. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Wonderful thoughts, Ella. I don't have too much to add. I think those were so on point. I just want to remind those who are here of past conversations we've had where we've noted already in the earlier books of the laws that, much like he does in the Republic, Plato gets out in front of the problem of wealth inequality and has some very strict rules about how wealth and property are to be divided in a society, precisely because he doesn't want Magnesia to start off with ice cream cones disproportionately divided, because otherwise, if that's the case, then as we were talking about a moment ago, the elector system is not going to work because those with all the ice cream cones are going to work in the background to engage in some shenanigans. And so that is definitely part of this discussion. And, it's a challenging thing with a work of this size, but it is an organic work where all of those parts are fitting together. And I think your comments brought back how we can't think of leader selection in a vacuum. We can't think, oh, this is just an isolated problem and it's independent of whatever other political problems we might be solving. That's not how Plato is thinking. And that may be leading to Darren's comment about this can feel a little disorganized. I don't know that I think of the text as disorganized. I think it's that Plato realizes all these problems are interconnected. And so he's sort of ping-ponging around a little bit in the way the dialogue is structured, because you can't ultimately disentangle these problems from each other. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next reading. And when I complete the reading, I'm going to go ahead and give Ian a chance to jump in here. Even if your comment is a more general comment, Ian, that's fine. I just want to get this next reading out in front of us. So our second reading is going to involve a different type of selection than an election. This is going to discuss the notion of a lottery. And I'll say a little bit about that after I do the reading. So we're going to get two topics here, two senses of equality. That'll be the first topic. And then in the second part of the reading, there's going to be the discussion of selection by both election and lot. Athenian. A system of selection like that will affect a compromise between a monarchical and a democratic constitution, which is precisely the sort of compromise a constitution should always be. You see, even if you proclaim that a master and his slave shall have equal status, friendship between them is inherently impossible. The same applies to the relations between an honest man and a scoundrel. Indiscriminate equality for all amounts to inequality, and both fill a state with quarrels between its citizens. How correct the old saying is that equality leads to friendship. It's right enough and it rings true, but what kind of equality has this potential is a problem which produces ripe confusion. This is because we use the same term for two concepts of equality, which in most respects are virtual opposites. The first sort of equality of measures, weights, and numbers is within the competence of any state and any legislator. That is, one can simply distribute equal awards by lot. But the most genuine equality, and the best, is not so obvious. It needs the wisdom and judgment of Zeus, and only in a limited number of ways does it help the human race. But when states or even individuals do find it profitable, they find it very profitable indeed. The general method I mean is to grant much to the great and less to the less great, adjusting what you give to take account of the real nature of each. Specifically, to confer high recognition on great virtue. But when you come to the poorly educated in this respect, to treat them as they deserve. We maintain, in fact, that statesmanship consists of essentially this: strict justice. This is what we should be aiming at now, Clinias. This is the kind of equality we should concentrate on as we bring our state into the world. The founder of any other state should also concentrate on the same goal when he frames his laws, and take no notice of a bunch of dictators, or a single one, or even the power of the people. He must always make justice his aim, and this is precisely as we've described it. It consists of granting the equality that unequals deserve to get. Yet on occasion, a state as a whole, unless it is prepared to put up with a degree of friction in one part or another, will be obliged to apply these concepts in a rather rough and ready way, because complacence and tolerance, which always wreck complete precision, are the enemies of strict justice. You can now see why it was necessary to avoid the anger of the man in the street by giving him an equal chance in the lot. Though even when we prayed to the gods of good luck to make the lot give the right decisions. So though force of circumstances compels us to employ both sorts of equality, we should employ the second, which demands good luck to prove successful, as little as possible. So much, my friends, for the justification of our policy, which is the policy of a state must follow if it means to survive. The state is just like a ship at sea, which always needs someone to keep watch night and day. As it is steered through the waves of international affairs, it lives in constant peril, being captured by all sorts of conspiracies. Hence the need of an unbroken chain of authority right through the day and into the night, and then on to the next day, guard relieving guard in endless succession. But a large body will never be able to act quickly enough, and most of the time we have to leave the majority of council members free to live their private lives and administer their own establishments. We must therefore divide the members of the council into 12 groups, one for each month, and have them go on guard by turns. They must be available promptly whenever anyone from abroad or from within the state itself approaches them wishing to give information or inquire about those topics on which a state must arrange to answer the questions of other states and receive replies to its own. They must be particularly concerned with the constant revolutions of all kinds that are apt to occur in a state. If possible, they must prevent them, but failing that, they must see that the state gets to know as soon as possible, so that the outbreak can be cured. That is why this executive committee has to be in charge of convening and dissolving not only statutory meetings, but also those held in some national emergency. The authority that should see to all of this, a 12th of the council, will of course be off duty for 11/12ths of the year. It's the section of the council on duty that must cooperate with other officials and keep a watchful eye on the state. That will be a reasonable arrangement for the city. But what about the rest of the country? How should it be superintended and organized? Well, now, the entire city and the entire country have been divided into 12 sections. There are the roads of the central city. There are houses, public buildings, harbors, the market, and fountains. There are, above all, sacred enclosures and similar places. Shouldn't all these things have officials appointed to look after them? Naturally, Clinias says. The Athenian continues, we can say then that the temples should have attendants and priests and priestesses. Next, there are the duties of looking after streets and public buildings, ensuring that they reach the proper standards, stopping men and animals from doing them damage, and seeing that conditions both in the suburbs and the city itself are in keeping with a civilized life. All these duties require 3 types of officials to be chosen. The city wardens, as they will be called, will be responsible for the points we've just mentioned, and the market wardens for the correct conduct of the market. And the reason I included the last part there on the reading is just to give us a little taste of how the discussion starts to build out the administrative state from beyond the guardians of the laws. Well, I didn't go on in that because I assumed all of you wouldn't want to sit here and have me just read out the long list of administrative roles, but keep that in the background of your mind as we go through this discussion. So the things I want us to think about primarily is this notion of different types of equality here, and his insistence that we have to maintain one type of inequality, namely the inequality of virtue. And remember, when he talks about this notion of education, where he says, but when you come to the poorly educated in this respect, should treat them as they deserve. That does not mean something like you get to beat up on the poorly educated. That is not what he's talking about. Education here means lacking in virtue if you're not educated, okay? And treating them as they deserve means they are not going to be people that we're going to seek to place as guardians of the laws, or even probably county wardens and market wardens. So he is maintaining an inequality about who gets to serve in these positions based on an inequality of people's progress towards virtue. So that's the big idea here. And I'd be curious to hear how people want to talk about different parts of this. Now, Ian, I'm aware that your comment may not be directly on this reading, but go ahead and jump in here wherever you have thoughts.
Thanks. I was thinking about the nature of equality, and going back to the previous section, I think it was the voting section that Darren had commented on. For the first three classes, they're compelled to vote. But for the fourth class, no. This was at 756D. So I'm wondering what kind of inequality accounts for the possibility of the fourth class not even be compelled to vote.
And remind us, Ian, what is the fourth class?
Well, I'm not 100% sure. The highest property class shall be compelled to vote. You know, there's a mixture of persuasion and compulsion in this. And I'm not sure that we've necessarily come to grips with the compulsive aspects of it, those things which citizens shall be forced to do, and whether that even accords with our idea of freedom. But at 756C, it says, first for counselors from the highest property class, all citizens shall be compelled to vote, and whoever disobeys shall be fined with the fine decreed. And then on the second day, people from the second class shall be voted for. On the third day, for counselors from the third class, who chooses shall vote, and the voting shall be compulsory for members of the third classes, but for those of the fourth and lowest class, they shall be let off the fine in case any of them do not wish to vote.
Could I take a stab at this?
Yeah, go ahead, Darren.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I wonder if we're talking about different people being voted for, though. So at 755B and C, so there's a kind of transition here between voting for the guardians of the laws versus now, and then at 755C, they say, okay, now for the election of the other officials one by one. And then we're talking, and then all these various people we have to vote for now. So there's actually a lot of voting in this society, probably way more than maybe we would be interested in today. You know, there's a lot of people to vote for. So my sense is that voting for the guardians of the laws is compulsory for everyone. That's a sense I get from the previous discussion. And then when it comes to these other people, so we're talking about generals, company commanders, cavalry commanders, and going down here. Yeah, then we get to this discussion about the lower classes. The lower classes thing was brought up in the, I think, last book, where there was a discussion about property and how, you know, some people would just have less, it seems. So my sense of maybe why they're not forced to vote. So there are remarks later on in book 6, yeah, this book, about how the people in the upper class or certain kinds of work is reserved for certain kind of leadership roles are reserved for people from the top class only, not even the second or third. And the reasoning was that only they will have enough time and maybe resources to dedicate themselves to those roles. So maybe the lowest class here aren't forced to vote. I mean, they can vote. It's just that they're not compelled to because maybe they just have a lot to do. Maybe there's something like that going on. I don't know. I'm just trying to, yeah, this is just my stab at it.
Yeah, I mean, one possibility here is that there's always a question, even in our modern societies, about how much compulsion is worth enforcing. For example, in our modern societies, we could have more stringent laws on telling a lie. We could make it illegal to ever tell a lie. But the problem is it would be so expensive just trying to go around policing everything that people say that it's just not practical, even if a society thought, yeah, it's always bad to lie. So I wonder if here, part of what Plato's thinking is, and remember, this is a section where we're talking about the second best society. So this is not the society where class has been abolished. This is the society where there's a ceiling on wealth inequality. So no one can own 4 times more than the lowest class. You do have a class system, but it's a very narrow class system. We live in countries today where people have 10,000 times what the lowest class has. So it's very, very different context than what we typically think of. But nonetheless, it is the second best system that Plato puts forward here. And I think what he's thinking is, well, the higher in class you are, the more responsibility you have. And the more we expect you to be responsive to the state compelling you to fulfill your social obligations. Whereas the people at the lowest class, who are going to be more numerous, we expect less of them. We expect them to be less responsive to that sense of social duty and obligation. That would be my kind of first thought in reading this. Does that help at all, Ian?
Yeah, it sounds like certainly possible interpretations of this. And my other question was about how this setup affects a mean between monarchy and democracy. This was at 756E.
Right. Is the beginning of the passage that I read. So the idea here is, in something like a monarchy, you have the power is consolidated in one person or a select few is supposed to be the idea. Whereas in a democracy, the idea is that the power is sort of distributed across the whole populace. And this model that they've put forward, I didn't put this in the handout, but it's the paragraph that immediately precedes it there. The model is that we have sort of half being selected by this rigorous method of election, and then half being selected by a lottery. And the lottery is actually supposed to be the democratic institution, and the election is the monarchical side of this, because it's selecting the virtuous, who are going to be the guardians who serve every month. A small portion of them are going to be the guardians for that month. And that may surprise us, because we typically think elections go with democracies, but actually in Plato's day, elections were not associated with democracies. If you wanted a democracy, what you needed was a lottery, because a lottery actually allows everybody to be included in the selection process, because it's a random process, whereas elections tend to favor certain classes, which is what Plato, I think, wants us to consider here. The favoritism is directed towards the virtuous, whereas the lottery, anybody can get selected in a lottery. So there's a kind of balancing between the two that he's putting forward. Does that make sense, Ian, about at least what
Yes, I
monarchical
think
and democratic refers to?
definitely. I think that is right, that it's the lottery system as well as the elections.
Right.
One last question about this. Would it have made more sense for people to have been tested for virtue before they were voted upon than
Right.
after they were voted upon?
Well, he gives us at least a clue as to why he organizes it the way that he does. Yeah, right here on your screen, you should see in this reading that I gave, he says, you can now see why it was necessary to avoid the anger of the man in the street by giving him an equal chance in the lot. So the idea here is you want scrutiny to come in after and not before, because you want there to be some sense in which the leader selected truly can be anybody. There needs to be room for that, not just to appease the man in the street here, as he says, but also because, as Plato makes clear in other parts of the laws, virtuous people can be found anywhere. So you need something in the system that makes it clear that nobody's being arbitrarily excluded from the get-go, that every single citizen is a potential candidate for the guardianship, even though by scrutiny that's not true. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, so there's a balancing act here, and we can question this. You know, we might think there are better ways to perform the balancing act than what's been put forward here. But the idea is to put forward a balancing act of creating a society where, in principle, anybody can serve, but in practice, only the virtuous serve. And that's not an easy balance to strike. And this is one proposal. It's one way of doing it. There might be others. Okay, thanks, Ian. Wonderful comments. Thanks for directing us to the text. James, jump in here.
I really like the line, indiscriminate equality leads to inequality. And that's kind of like, I guess, when the scoundrels take over. And I think we see this happening before our eyes here, 2,400 years after Plato wrote the words, that, there are some representatives, and, I'm thinking maybe of, a couple maybe in the US Congress and some others elsewhere in the world who display not only ignorance, but willful ignorance. And it's because they have managed to maneuver the system to get themselves in power, and they are seen perhaps as useful idiots for other people to manipulate and operate. All that counts is their votes, not their ideas. And it really does subject the population to the whims of these people who just simply are not willing to even learn, much less to exercise any sort of virtue or intelligence. So I think that's a really interesting idea, and it's something that we have to come to grips with, I think, in our society, because there is this kind of real inequality in terms of our representation that's happening right before our eyes. I think, Plato is often seen as an elitist. And so if we say, well, somebody really doesn't have the intelligence or the virtue to run for office, well, is that fair? And I guess maybe nowadays we see that as unfair, but I think we may be seeing the results of that. And that I think that actually is right there in that line. The other one of the interesting things I thought was this idea of the council operating. So one council member would be on duty for a month, and that would give them the other 11 months of the year for their own responsibilities. And that was an interesting concept, because that's, the other thing we get nowadays is professional politicians, people who really do nothing in their lives except earn money from holding political offices. And some people, especially if they do this early in their stage, develop a reliance on it, I think. And it becomes maybe more of a tribal exercise at that point. I think the virtuous leader is a leader that really has to treat everybody equally, and the leader has to treat people equally in terms of their potential, I guess. But I think now, I mean, there was quite a display last week. It was the relatively new president of Argentina held a rock concert. He was actually performing in this rock concert. And then after he played, he proceeded to rant about how the left in Argentina must be defeated. And, here's a leader who was really operating unequally, I think, and unfairly to those with certain ideas, demonstrating that he's just a leader of one particular faction in the country. And I think this is where the equality needs to come in. So, do we think that it's elitist to have some sort of requirement that there be this kind of equal treatment of people? Or, but I think somehow we need to find our way around that elitist argument. So thank you.
Yeah, I think James's comments really capture the spirit of what's being discussed here, that not everybody should have a voice. And that's really hard for modern audiences to hear. But James mentioned my country of the United States. We have a lady in our Congress by the name of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has the same voting power as any other member of the House of Representatives, but she exercises that power in a very disruptive and abusive manner. And so there's an equality between her and her colleagues that results in a disproportionate inequality where she can have a really outsized effect on the ability of the House of Representatives to maintain itself as a functioning body. And so that's an example where I think you're right, James, that Plato would say, why are you giving indiscriminate equality here? It should be that the House of Representatives is made up of people who are not seeking power for themselves and who want to exercise powers in a way that benefits the common good. And that's where I want to again say Plato does insist on equality, is that someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene will still benefit from the work of the virtuous, meaning in Plato's model, virtuous people will create a society in which she will have a chance to become a better person as a result of living in that society. So the goal here is not to exclude these other people from the benefits of the common good. It's just to say they shouldn't be the ones who are the guardians of the laws, who are charged with bringing the common good about. Phil?
I myself was focusing on the whole of the administrative state. I've been wondering, like, where does the bureaucracy comes in? And I think it comes in here. Because in order to complete it, there are many, many specialties they have to deal with. I mean, there are the guardians, they all have the virtue, and then the administrative state, they have all the virtues. And I think the Greek concept of virtue is arete, that means excellence in whatever your task is. If you're the administrative state, the bureaucracy, and shipping, you will have a different arete in terms of the sturdiness of the ship, how it sails, all these kind of things. And if you are farming, then you will have a different kind of virtue, and so on. And it seems to me the virtue of the guardians is the ability to make judgment about justice, the relationship between the distribution of how things should be done in relationship to balancing, I guess, the fairness of these sort of undeterminable virtues, which in a sense you have to find and make a judgment, a wise judgment, not an absolute judgment, because by Zeus is the only one that knows the absolute judgments. And so therefore, you must be able to have somebody in there that could make a wise decision that's close to true justice, but not absolutely justice, which is different from shipbuilding and crafts and engineering and all that stuff. And so you have to fill it with all these things, in which then, in a sense, the guardians could come in and say, and talk about, shipbuilding, like, tell me about it. I mean, I really don't know that much. I could judge your character about that. And so that's important. What I find a little distant to my mind is the period of the service. I think these people probably should be instituted in the bureaucracy in the long term, but maybe they have periods of rotation, because I do like the fact that they don't become just absolute professionals, that they have to, in a sense, live their lives and do other things. But I think that if, let's say, if you have a body of, let's say, 100 of such bureaucrats, partial bureaucrats, then maybe if you have, let's say, a committee of 3 at any rotation, then in a sense, as one rotates out, 2 remain, so that you keep a continuity. So it's not like, every time like there's a switch, different group of people with slightly different judgments, it'll be weaving in and out too much. But if you have like always 2 of the old guys and 1 new guy, then in a sense of the continuity that flows in relationship to that. And then you also have enough, let's say they serve for I guess would be 3-month terms, because of the 1 month, so forth. And then you still have a life on its own, but without disturbing the bureaucracy itself. In a sense, it's always a continuity. There'll be changes, but the change won't be jerking left and right all that much. So I think that 1 month and a sudden rotation, I think that's too right angle as far as I'm concerned, or it could be. I do like the fact that it doesn't take it into a strictly professional thing in which, you're living in Washington, D.C. your whole life. You're disconnected from everything and all that. But on the other hand, like you live 9 months back home doing your thing, whatever it is you do, and you spend 3 months, with 2 different colleagues each turn around. So I think that balance keeps the continuity with refreshing at the same time. That's it, Phil.
Lovely thoughts, Phil. Just want to add real quick, and then I'll move on to Darren and Ella, that not only do we have this rotational model, which, as Phil said, requires the guardians to be ordinary citizens for most of the year, they also have term limits and mandatory retirement ages, minimum and maximum ages, and so forth. So there's really strict limits on not just who can do this, but for how long and in what manner and so forth. So there's no sense in which they're serving in a position where what they're trying to do is perpetuate their own power. Before they ever get into office, they know exactly when they're going to serve, for how long, and when they're done. And there's no campaigns, there's no trying to focus on what's the hot topics in an election year or anything like that that's driving the function of the guardians of the laws.
Yeah, I
And
wish we had that in the Supreme Court.
Well, okay, the United States Supreme Court would be a good place to raise a question like that. But I'll note that in the United States' original conception of Congress, they were actually assuming that the members of Congress would be something closer to this. They did not imagine that it would be a year-round, full-time position that you gave up your job and all of that. And you see little hints of that in the United States Constitution, where these, like the State of the Union, at least once a year, the president has to talk to the Congress. Well, that's in there because they assumed most of the time the president and the Congress are not even going to be anywhere around each other. They're going to be back farming or whatnot. And so that the political class as a profession is really a much later development. And I think it has become a problematic development. And I'll just note that the title page excerpt that I quoted for you, the proposal that Alexander Guerrero puts forward is the idea of creating single issue task force. So you get rid of anything like a single legislative body, and instead you have people who get selected by lot to solve a particular problem, say, housing crisis or climate change or whatever. and they serve for a length of time as they work on that problem. And then when the time comes, they're either swapped out with somebody else or the task force is dissolved. And that's his proposal for abolishing essentially a professional class of politicians, which again, it's just another interesting imaginative proposal expanding our horizons. I'm looking at the time here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give Darren and Ellen a chance to make a couple quick comments, and then I'm going to go ahead and at least read that third passage, and then we'll see if we want to have any discussion on it. Okay. So Darren and then Ella.
So one more thing regarding the officials is that at least for some of the country wardens that come up later, that they have to like move around the country and get to know the whole country. So that was an aspect I actually really liked, that, you know, they shouldn't just have knowledge of their corner of the land. I think, yeah, that's something different than what we do. Like we have our representatives for each area, but here they have these officials. They have to sort of move around. And there was a rationale for that. It was so that it provides with a greater sense of solidarity in community. So I think that is actually really um, advice that maybe we could incorporate. So I was really interested in this discussion of the two kinds of equality. So it says here that the first sort of equality of measures, weights, and numbers is within the competence of any state and any legislator. But then he says the most genuine equality and the best is not so obvious. It needs the wisdom and judgment of Zeus, and only in a limited number of ways does it help the human race, and so on. So there's just a couple of aspects I find interesting about this. So the first kind of equality measures weights and numbers. This is all stuff that you can sort of see that are visible. I mean, I guess we're just talking about politics here. So this is the stuff that you can see and measure and count. But the more genuine equality, he says, needs the wisdom and judgment of Zeus. And there are comments like this, like earlier in the earlier books too. Like this is not so obvious. It's not like you can look at a person and their features or even their charisma in politics and understand that, oh, this must be a virtuous person, because as we all know, attractive people, charismatic people doesn't necessarily make them good. But what does make, how do we identify the virtuous people? As this very passage says, it's not so obvious. Like there are people who act good, who act well, but then we find out they're actually terrible. Think of one of my childhood heroes, Lance Armstrong, the cyclist, who was basically a cheater, and we didn't find out until, you know, afterwards, after his career, more or less. So people can make them out to be like very heroic people, virtuous people. Even the people you think in your mind right now, hero, maybe they're not the hero, because what is important is their heart, and you can't see that. People have all sorts of incentives to look virtuous, to pretend they're virtuous, to act that way, to appear that way, to sound that way, but how do you know? So this is flagging that. So this is a hard, when you want to make virtue the center of a politics on which we can all agree on. I don't disagree that in the abstract, yes, that would be a great thing. That would be a great idea. Maybe Zeus can help us on this, but how do you actually put that into practice? In many places in the world where that has been tried, it does lead to a kind of aristocracy and elitism that ends up excluding a lot of people, because, you know, the wealthy are considered virtuous, but the best speakers are considered virtuous. The best speakers aren't necessarily the most knowledgeable people. A lot of psychological research have shown this, that the most knowledgeable people actually are usually much more circumspect than, you know, smooth talkers. And Plato flags this, right? So he wants us to have a society based on virtue, but how in the world, well, like, where is the oracle of Zeus where we can go and get this advice to figure out who truly is virtuous, right? This isn't just Plato's issue, right? This is also Kant's. Yeah. Like Kant says a lot in the groundwork about we can't even know our own hearts. Never mind other people. It's hard to know our own hearts, whether we ourselves are actually being good or just motivated by other self-interested things. Well, so yeah, maybe I'll just leave. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there.
It's all our issues. I mean, where to find wisdom is the problem we all face. I will say here that when Plato says it needs the wisdom and judgment of Zeus, that can sound like he's pointing to something that's just far and out of reach, but we have to remember this is the man who argued for the possibility of perceiving and contemplating the good. So What he's really trying to say here is that it's rare and difficult to grasp wisdom. But Plato is not somebody who thinks it's impossible. And he thinks even a few people have actually glimpsed wisdom directly. And so this is for him actually meant to be an optimistic statement that yes, it's rare and only on occasion does it ever get used to help anybody. But he does believe there is such a wisdom. It is accessible. And if we employed it, it would help people. And we may not agree with that, and that's fine. That's a different question. I just want us to remember that Plato is an optimist about the possibility of wisdom leading a society. Ella?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's, Darren brought up some good points that I'm going to also address in terms of the ethics and the morals and the wisdom of leadership. I think one thing to be a good leader would be to try to, at least in contemporary situations, since there is so much polarization, to look, at issues to be dealt with, to not say, well, this, representative in my state or that governor of that state and that party, and just try to de-escalate that so that we can have a presence of mind to not otherize everyone who is not of your viewpoint. They may not be of your class, they may not have the education, but I think as far as, with the workers voting for Trump, I think they wish they'd had more choices at the time. But they didn't, because both parties for 20 years, the Clintons, the Obamas, and before them, back the Bushes, had through globalization, which was especially important to liberals and global capitalists and Republicans, they had been left behind and their wages had gone down and they were losing their homes and they were being ignored. They were being looked down upon by the liberals, so they could no longer vote for the party that they had always voted for historically, the Democrats, and had no hope. And then they went to someone who was insincere and certainly not of leadership quality, who said that he would do something for them. So when you have two parties and it's Tweedledee or Tweedledum, and they're both playing the same game, as it were, and not addressing your needs, and your family is hungry and you're working two jobs and your wages are stagnant, I guess you don't have much of a choice. So the thing is to address these issues, to not polarize. And I think it's coming around to that now, to having respect for workers, for, President Biden talking about workers again and the things he's going to do to make sure they have jobs. And, I think that's the responsibility of all of us, and not certainly to understand the situation that they're in, not just the workers, but the poor, the impoverished, and all of our countries. But, I can only speak about America, and they come from a number of different groups. It's not just one group. So yeah, those are my thoughts. And I think in wisdom, we can not just see it. We need to look deeper into the issues and not just what seems to be the case. And perhaps some people may even know how deep this situation goes and how many people have suffered from being ignored and being used. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ella. I appreciate it. Again, finding these connections to our own context today is really important. So thank you. I just want to note for people that since Plato in this passage evokes again his famous ship of state analogy, I do have on page 9 of your handout the famous excerpt from the Republic where he gives that analogy in greater force. So that's a connection you might want to look at later. Phil, I'll go ahead and let you make just a really quick comment, and then I'll read the last passage. And then James, should we just wrap up from there?
Yeah, I think probably wrap up because we were already
Yeah.
about 6 minutes over time. So if folks are willing to stay online, saying, for another 10 minutes or
Yeah.
so, I think that will hopefully then do it for today. And we can always continue into book 7 next time.
So Phil, go ahead and just make a quick comment, and then I'm just going to wrap us up by reading the last. It's a very short excerpt from 769C to 771A. So go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I will say something quick. With Lance Armstrong, he was also my hero. But the thing is, before it was discovered that he was cheating, of course, we just thought he was a good cyclist. But afterwards, we realized he was a psychopath, not just a cyclist. And so the thing is, like, well, for most of us, we can't tell, we don't have the wisdom to tell for sure, but we could certainly tell after we understand the situation. And to continue to honor somebody after you know that they're a psychopath, then that's a real abuse. And we see that all the time. I mean, think of Donald Trump. There are people who still believe in him after it's shown that he is not worthy of being considered. You could maybe make that excuse, yeah, we didn't know who he was, but now we do know, and they refuse to understand. That's why you should take back the awards that Lance Armstrong won, because he didn't deserve those awards. I don't know whether they did or not, but nonetheless, we certainly have enough savvy to understand something after it's been done. Maybe not before, but after it's been done, maybe because maybe not all of us have the kind of wisdom that could make that distinction, but you have no excuse afterwards that, like, yeah, that's it. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. On the last part of the handout, I have 3 excerpts, 2 of which you've already heard read by James. I call them the 3 ideals of the good leader, the good state, and the good citizen. Since we already heard from 2 of those, I'm just going to read the second one here, which is a quick description of what it really means to build a good state. So we'll end with this as our closing thought, and then anybody else who has other thoughts, let James conclude the recording, and then we can stay on and continue the discussion. The Athenian says, suppose that one day somebody were to take it into his head to paint the most beautiful picture in the world, which would never deteriorate but always improve at his hands as the years went by. You realize that as the painter is not immortal, he won't achieve anything very permanent by lavishing such care and attention on his picture, unless he leaves some successor to repair the ravages of time. Won't his successor also have to be able to supplement deficiencies in his master's skill and improve the picture by touching it up? True, Clinias says. Athenian, well then, don't you think the legislature will want to do something similar? First of all, he'll want to write his laws and make them as accurate as he can. Then as time goes on and he tries to put his pet theories into practice, well, do you think there's any legislator so stupid as not to realize that his code has many inevitable deficiencies which must be put right by his successor? If the state he's founded is to enjoy a continuous improvement in its administrative arrangements rather than suffer a decline? Clinias says, yes, I think indeed I'm sure that this is the sort of thing any legislator will want to do. So if a legislator were able to discover a way of doing this, that is, if by instruction or pointing to concrete examples, he could make someone else understand perfectly or imperfectly how to keep laws in good repair by amending them, I suppose he'd never give up explaining his method until he got it across. Of course. So isn't this what you two and I ought to be doing right now? Clinias says, what do you mean? The Athenian responds, now that we, in the evening of life, are on the point of framing laws for which we have guardians already chosen, our juniors, oughtn't we to combine our law-giving with an attempt to turn them into lawgivers as well as law guardians as far as we can? Of course we ought, assuming we're up to it, Clinias says. The Athenian says, anyhow, we ought to try and do our level best. Certainly, Clinias says. The Athenian goes on, let's address them as follows. Quote, colleagues and protectors of our laws, we shall inevitably leave a great many gaps in every section of our code. However, we shall certainly take care to outline a sort of sketch of the complete system with its main points, and it will be your job to take this sketch and fill in the details. You ought to hear what your aim should be when you do this. Megillus and Clinias and I have mentioned it to each other more than once, and we are agreed that our formula is a good one. We want you to be sympathetic to our way of thinking and become our pupils, keeping in view this aim, which the three of us are unanimous, a giver and a guardian of laws should be. The central point on which we agree amounted to this. Our aim in life should be goodness and the spiritual virtue appropriate to mankind. There are various things that can assist us. It may be some pursuit we follow, a particular habit, or something we possess. We may get help from some desire we have, or some opinion we hold, or some course of study. And all of this is true of both male and female members of the community, young or old. Whatever the means, it's this aim we've described that we must all strain every muscle to achieve throughout our lives. No man, whoever he is, should ever be found valuing anything else if it impedes his progress, not even, in the last resort, the state. Rather than have the state tolerate the yoke of slavery and be ruled by unworthy hands, it may be absolutely necessary to allow it to be destroyed or abandon it by going into exile. All that sort of hardship we simply have to endure rather than permit a change of the sort of political system which will make men worse. This, then, is the agreed statement. Now it's up to you to consider this double aim of ours and censor the laws that can do nothing to help us. But you must commend and welcome the effective ones with enthusiasm and cheerfully live as they dictate. You must have no truck with other pursuits which aim at different goods, as people call them. End quote. Thanks, everyone, and I'll now turn it over to James to close us out.
Well, thank you, Michael, so much for preparing this and hosting the meeting. And I'm sorry we are running out of time to get to the other people who want to speak. But as Michael said, when we turn the recording off, we can continue the discussion and also continue it into book 7, which we'll look at in 2 weeks. I do want to say that ending quote, I think, is particularly powerful because it calls into need to understand that whatever laws we think we can conjure, inevitably there'll be problems with them. And it's important to allow some scope for time to operate here and to take a longer term view. And this is, I think, some of the, things that Ella was pointing to in terms of not necessarily the impetus being just for a short term view, but to establish some sort of longer term view, I think is key. And I think what Plato is doing here by focusing on virtue and also establishing a system that we talked about at the beginning of our meeting today that sets a sort of a collaborative mechanism and a mechanism with enough checks and balances, perhaps, that things will hopefully not get out of control. But it's a human civilization, so who knows? But all we can do is to construct things as best as possible and to really take a longer term view of time and to cultivate the next group of leaders as well, and to not think that we have all of the answers. So it's a very different prescription, I think, than the one that we are undergoing right now in the world. But it really struck me, as I posted our book 4 discussion, which happened 4 weeks ago, that's now available on the podcast. It really struck me that in that discussion, we brought Plato 2,400 years ahead in time and really looked at the modern situation and talked about the connections that were made to Plato. And I think we're doing it again this time. So it's a very interesting thing. I think there's some kind of timeless thinking in here that I think is useful. So thank you to all for attending. Thanks again, Michael, for coordinating this and preparing the notes for today. I will end the recording and invite everybody who wants to stay online for casual, unrecorded discussion to do so. And then otherwise, we will look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. So thank you, everybody.